Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm so excited to talk to Alex Kenna about Burn This Night. Alex is a writer, a prosecutor, and an amateur painter. I like all of those, Alex. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
So can you give the audience an overview about what Burn This Night is about?
Yeah, my protagonist is a private investigator. Her backstory is that she was a police officer with LAPD. She had a devastating car accident that led to an opiate addiction, and then ended up going out on disability, lost custody of her daughter, her marriage disintegrated. All that kind of happened in the past. And when the story picks up, she's rebuilding her life. She's living with her mother and Airbnb-ing her house to raise money for a custody battle. That's going not so well. And in the middle of, intergenerational tension, she learns that her father, her beloved father who raised her, was not her biological dad, and that instead she's distantly related to a cold case killer in a small mountain town. And she's at the same time hired to investigate a second murder in that same town involving a mentally ill man who destroyed his brain with methamphetamine, who's accused of starting this deadly fire that killed his sister and some other people. So it's kind of three mysteries in one, because she goes to the town, stays there for a while, investigates the arson murder, looks into this cold case killing, and also sort of explores what she learned about her family secrets and starts looking into her parentage. And it's three different mysteries that are all kind of interconnected.
So you don't really give any of your characters much of a break, do you, Alex?
No, I'm a total sadist.
I mean, I think you torture all of them, much to this reader's delight. I mean, I don't really want these people tortured, but I mean, you give us a lot to think about in this. So when we look at Kate Miles, I think just the fact that you grow up thinking that one parent is your parent and then you learn they're not, I think that is something that is so jarring, because I remember in the second grade, my teacher said, was one of your parents divorced? I don't really know. Maybe divorce was in 1971. That was the conversation to have. And I was so sure that if one of my parents was divorced, it must be my dad. Turned out it was my mom. And I remember that, as little as that is, today I think we think, oh, that's not a big thing. Back then it was a big thing. And I think that's exactly what you've done with Kate. You've given us a woman who was so sure of where she was in her lane, and all of a sudden not anymore. So why was that important to give that to Kate? Was it just for the trials and tribulations, or was there something involved there?
Yeah, I think I'm very interested, but both as a writer and also just as a human, in people who've lived a lot of lives and who've had to kind of reinvent themselves. So for her, and I was interested in the idea of her having this past career and having to start over again, and also to kind of discover that she had a completely different genetic history than she was expecting. I wanted to kind of explore what that was like psychologically. And I went down the rabbit hole and listened to all of these podcasts of people who had discovered that their parents weren't their parents. And it's extremely common now because of genetic websites. And that sense of, the whole narrative thread that had existed throughout a person's life, and how the pieces fit in, and, how your oval shaped face came from your grandmother, and then all of a sudden that's ripped away.
Right.
At some time it's just the incredible head trip that causes. It was something I was interested in exploring. And I think with her character, it's also, I think there's a danger of, you want to give somebody a dark backstory and you come up with one thing, but life doesn't really work that way. It's kind of just because someone had something awful happen to them, the rest of their life isn't roses. you usually people have multiple traumas, and then maybe something good will happen, and all of those things kind of have to work together to make a person human. So adding that in also gave me, another element to work with, where she's got her marriage imploded, and she's got problems with her mother, and she's in physical pain, and now she has this other kind of head trip to deal with.
And a lovely thing you did as an author is you gave her relationship with her daughter. We realize how very important that is. Some things have gone on in her life that she made some choices and they didn't go exactly the way she'd hoped they would go, and they might have gone badly. But her love for her daughter was so consistent all through the narrative that you created, which was so beautiful because as a parent, you hope you do the right thing. We all know that we all make mistakes, but I felt like her heart was in the right place, which was so fun.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to have somebody who's a good mother, but not a perfect mother, because I don't think you necessarily see that as much as you should in fiction. I think a lot of the time, either mama is the saint who you put on the pedestal, and she's wonderful, and she had no resources, but she supported you and put you through college, or mom is a monster and she destroyed you as a human, and you don't really see a lot of representations of that. And and I think a lot of the time when you see a mother in fiction, that's kind of that's their whole purpose. You take, when the gorgeous Hollywood actress, is my age, like they're only playing the moms, and then they just come out to like give a, supportive pat on somebody's shoulder. Then they go back into the scenery. So, I wanted to add that element to kind of give a more complex mother figure who's, not perfect, but also, doing their best and loves their child. And
I did love that. I really did, because you could see that love come through. And I think that particular love also made it a little more difficult with her and her mom, where they were. Because, when you find out that you've grown up in a bubble and that bubble is now pierced, all of a sudden you see life slightly different. But I do love the fact that you took Kate, not in a very bitter way, but Kate is trying to discover how she can make her life better. And that was a lovely thing for me to read.
yeah, and I think she's also she's not a very introspective person by nature. She's just not very, she focuses kind of on other people. And so it was an interesting challenge as a writer, to put her in a situation where she's kind of forced to be more introspective and forced to go into kind of this journey, because she's an ex police officer. She doesn't sit around and navel gaze about who am I, until suddenly her sense of who she is ripped away, and then she kind of has no choice. So that was kind of an interesting opportunity for her to grow, and for her to have to confront some issues with her mother, and have to confront some issues with herself and her self-perception.
I love it. So now let's talk about the Coburn siblings, because I think that what you've done is, so I think every reader will be able to say they've known three siblings who have different ways of looking at life. We have Grace, who is beautiful, and she is very directly, she knows what her mind is. She said yes or no, and there's no changing that. And then we see Abby, who she's very pliable. She understands life, but she also understands that life is not predictable. And then we have Jacob, who is totally unpredictable. And, I love that. So talk about how challenging and fun writing these three siblings were for you as an author.
Yeah, that was kind of how I started the book. I sort of had the idea of these three siblings before everything else kind of built around it. And part of it is, I just have, from having been a prosecutor in LA for a decade, I've seen a lot of how meth affects the community, and I wanted to tell that story of both what meth can do to a human mind, which is Jacob. You see how he's really damaged over the course of the book. It's kind of told in flashbacks, and also I wanted to kind of explore how different people can react to that in different ways. So Grace basically cuts him off. I originally had more chapters from her perspective, but I wanted to tighten things up a little bit. But she's very no nonsense. She's also a prosecutor, and she can't forgive him. She thinks she's kind of done. And Abby, who's she's more of a humanist, and she starts out as an actress because she operates based on feeling, and then she ends up that doesn't pan out very well, so she ends up in social work school and is kind of studying people who suffer Jacob from the same problems that Jacob is suffering. So that was something I really wanted to explore because just miscommunication was a big theme in the book, and people who are all decent human beings, including Jacob, even though he does some pretty awful things. Has a decent heart at the end of it, but who are just kind of circling each other and not able to fully connect just because they're kind of wired differently from each other. So I had that kind of miscommunication as a plot mover and motivator, both going on with the Coburn siblings and also with Kate and her mother.
So one of the things you did, Alex, is you tapped into real life. And I loved that. It's one of the things we talked about before we began to record. I think it's easy to dismiss something because, maybe I'm like Grace. Maybe I don't understand exactly where someone's coming from. Or maybe I'm like Abby and I want to be inclusive. Or maybe I'm like Jake and I just want to implode and I just want to live my life. What you did was you wove three siblings together and you said, this is what happens in real life, because it is what happens in real life. I have a friend that 10 or 15 years ago, he was a casual meth user, and he's now what I often refer to as slipped into schizophrenia. And he's now medicated for schizophrenia. I did not realize, because here's Dan with his little rose-colored glasses. I'm like, oh, look, an Energizer bunny. What I didn't realize is this Energizer bunny was wired up with meth. He could do 2 or 3 days without sleeping. I've been one day in my life when I didn't sleep overnight. I will never do that again. Some people, they feed on it, obviously, if they have a substance that helps them feed on it. And what I realized in reading this was, I looked at Jacob as a fully formed character who simply, for whatever reason, gets into this life cycle that he can't get out of. And, I think the average person says, oh, well, just, buck up, stop doing this, stop doing that. But when you're doing something like meth, it's not that easy. Do you see a lot of that as a prosecutor?
Yeah, I mean, less now. I do things that are a little more on the white collar end of the spectrum. But I used to be just a line prosecutor at the DA's office, and you would see cases all the time where you could almost sometimes tell from the police report because you'd have crazy crimes almost where somebody massacres someone's lawn ornaments, which I mean that's happened at least once, but
Okay,
but
I love that. But I mean, I know it's crazy, but I might like that. Go ahead.
but crazy things that are just not a lot of crime, it's
Not
motivated by
normal.
poverty, or there's a normal motivation, there's normal theft, but and then sometimes something insane happens, and that's where then it's usually meth. But people come in and there's certain just patterns that you start observing of how people are being affected, and you see people come in more than once, and you can see that the same problems are getting worse, and you talk to families, and that's always the most heartbreaking part. There's people's families will be in the audience, and especially in the types of cases where you sort of try to work out a disposition where someone's going to get treatment instead of a different kind of outcome, and you see how parents and siblings a lot of the time, kind of like with the Coburn siblings, can be completely split, where maybe the sister doesn't want to have anything to do with this person anymore because of all the trauma, and the parents can't let go, and the parents are jumping in, and it's really heartbreaking. But it's also incredibly common, and I think it's something that doesn't get a lot of attention in the news. So that was one reason I wanted to tell that story, especially like when you mentioned your friend. There's a really good article in the Atlantic of probably a couple years ago. I think it was Sam Quinones, who also wrote a couple books on this topic about how meth has become so much more potent, and that type of brain damage, which is not always reversible, is becoming more and more common because the meth is much less diluted. and now it's incredibly potent. And you're seeing people, not everyone, obviously. Some people are lucky to, eventually get out of the cycle and escape. But some people, you can end up with brain damage incredibly quickly, and then that it just the cycle just continues and continues. And then sometimes people do horrible things while they're on, in order to get more meth, or while they're on meth, which is something that happens with Jacob. And then that guilt can kind of compound things too. And then you to get away from that sense of guilt or that sense of shame, you end up going back to the drug that's causing the problems in the first place. So yeah, I wanted to tell that story, and I wanted to do it as unflinching as I could, without but also in small doses, because you can't just write a whole book of a person suffering in that way. I think that would be that wouldn't be fair to an audience. So with Jacob, I was able to kind of tell that story through flashbacks, and then I tried to intersperse it with other chapters that were maybe not a total bummer. So it's, Jake, here's a Jacob chapter. And then after that, you can have, oh, look, Kate met a hot wood carver.
Right.
So it's a little balance.
Well, it is a balance. And, I do want to compliment you, Alex. I think that what you did was you gave us fully formed characters who, pardon this, some of them are fucked up and some have some bad issues, and what you've done is you've like peeled the layers off of our eyes and said, this exists. What you didn't do, I totally agree, is that wasn't the entire narrative. Because I do want to say that, so I was reading a chapter where Abby was having a moment with Nick, and I thought it was Kate having a moment with Sam.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, I don't remember what the sentence was, but I was like, wait. So I go back and I'm like, what? Who is talking here? And I realized that it was Abby. And I was like, well, look at that now, because you just led me into something that was so easy and so fun, that the narratives were so similar. The outcomes were very different, but the narrative
Mm-hmm.
of their relationship was so similar. And I loved that. You gave us these things of hope, which I think is one of the things that anytime you read a book that has some tough things to deal with, we need hope. So talk to me a little bit about hope and where you hoped things would go and what was important to you as an author.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important also as an author. Also people read partially for escape. I mean, you can read something dark, but you don't want, if, I remember reading starting to read a really award-winning, wonderful book a few years back, and it was just not like the happiest time. And I stopped partway through because it was just every chapter was beating you over the head with human misery, and there was never a break from it. And sometimes, even if it's hats off to the writer, you don't want to dwell on that. And I don't think anything's off limits, because people can handle it. People are adults. But at the same time, it can't just be, okay, I'm gonna brutalize people throughout. But it's also in the same, especially for dealing with addiction issues. I think I didn't, in the same way that I wanted to be kind of unflinching and be honest about things, I also wanted to, I didn't want to create a stigma because people do have addictive personalities and lead happy, fulfilling lives. People hit rock bottom and then they recover and then they move on. So I wanted to kind of have some parallels. There's this she has an addictive personality. There's another character who kind of emerges partway through the book who has an addictive personality. And Kate's kind of cut herself off from drugs. The other person is kind of, I guess, a functional alcoholic, but is still leads a fairly decent life. And Jacob is the total other end of the spectrum. So I kind of wanted to talk about those issues and have different people who are going through it in different ways. But I think hope is also really important, because it's also in part because it creates a better story, and in part because it's reality. Not everybody goes through something dark or is unlucky enough to have been built, wired with a certain tendency. And and necessarily succumbs to darkness in the end of it.
Totally agree. So I do want to talk about two quick things. One thing is, so Jacob is involved in some nefarious activities. And having grown up in the South, there was a story in the late 80s where this big farmer needed his workers to be more productive. So he sold them cocaine. He managed to subtract it from their pay, but he needed them to be more active. And, that was one of the things that when I was reading Jacob has this story that, someone who takes drugs, we understand that there's a whole bunch of things that go on before the first person takes a drug. But there are people out there who will exploit that drug addiction. And it unfortunately happens far too often. And it was heartbreaking. And yet at the same time, you gave us a chance to love Jacob even more. And I appreciate that, Alex. I really do.
Yeah, I think I didn't want him to just be a monster, because then people would say, okay, well, I don't care whether he really did it or not. I hate him. Why am I reading about this degenerate? And I think it happens in real life that because a person can do horrible things doesn't mean that they're all bad. And I think one of the tragedies of the addictions is that it can lead people down a path when, at their core, not everybody necessarily is, maybe that the darkness of what has happened doesn't necessarily represent who they are. So I wanted Jacob to be well-rounded and not just, a stereotype of somebody who has, fallen into addiction and done some terrible things. And I was interested in developing this. He kind of goes down a criminal circuit and gets involved with some unsavory characters. So that was kind of a fun area to write.
I think it's probably in your wheelhouse, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Well, one of them, he gets one of the schemes he ends up getting involved in was something that people tried on my grandmother. It was, they, luckily she didn't end up falling for it, but you definitely, well, she kind of did, but my aunt stepped in. But you see some of these schemes all the time, and then I wanted to make that as realistic as possible. And who knows, maybe somebody will read my book and not fall for something.
Totally agree. So now I'm going to end on a little bit of a high note. So this book is so wonderful. I'm going to do this again. It's called Burn This Night. This book is so wonderful, but I don't want Alex and I to leave the podcast on a down note. So I will tell you that Kate's biological father tickled the stuffings out of me because it was just such a fun thing. So now tell me you like clowns or magicians, I think it is, right?
Yeah, no, there's a discussion of an old time magician there. Well, I kind of came to me because my grandmother on my dad's side, she lived in Medina, Ohio, and there was this antique mall that was nearby, and my mom and I would always go whenever we went and visited her, and it was full of all kinds of weird things. And they used to have these giant like antique magician posters, and I remember being totally fascinated by those as a kid. So I don't know why my brain works in strange ways. Sometimes things just kind of pop in, and it's like, oh, okay, well, why don't I throw in an antique magician, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, I didn't want to say too much about him because he's kind of a surprise, but I do like him as a character.
He's so fun. So, and I don't want to give too much away either, but the person who goes and sits just off of the periphery so they can listen, I'm like, I know that person right there. I love that. So 100% recommend Burn This Night by Alex Kenna. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Let's do it again soon for book 3.
Excellent.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at Go Out with Dan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.